Welcome to the file once whispered about and nearly erased from Louisiana's history. The story of the voodoo nun who cursed the iron bars, and whose song, they say, still echoes through the swamp. They said she sang through the bars, not a hymn, not a prayer, something older, something that made the iron sweat. When the guards walked past her cell, they said the air was thicker than smoke. The lantern light flickered. And from somewhere deep in that wooden jailhouse in St. Landry Parish, a voice rose like a fever. Half whisper, half curse. If the Lord won't open the door, the river will. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Because every time this story is told, someone somewhere claims to hear that same sound again. July 1903. Louisiana, a land of heat and rot, of river mist and sugarcane fire. Freedom had been written into law nearly half a century before. But in the South, freedom was just another word men learned to twist. And inside a small wooden cell built for punishment, not prayer, there was a woman the wardens refused to name. They called her the Sister. Not because she belonged to the church, but because she belonged to something older than Scripture. In the official record of Angola prison, her name appears only once, faint, almost invisible. Marguerite Laveau. Colored. Age 33. Offense witchcraft. There was no code for that. But Louisiana didn't need one. The guards said she carved marks into the floorboards with a spoon. The preacher said she spoke to the air, and the air answered. And one night, the blackbird fell dead outside her cell. The next morning, the iron was bleeding rust. Some say it was the devil. Others say it was justice. But those who heard it, those who lived to tell, swore the air itself trembled, as if the earth had begun to remember its forgotten children. You can almost hear it now behind the bars, under the hum of the cicadas. Through the broken hymns of the cane fields, that same voice rising, slow, deliberate, defiant. If the Lord won't open the door, the river will. And somewhere deep inside the bayou, where daylight never quite breaks, something old still listens, something that was never freed. Louisiana, 1903. The river still spoke louder than the law. The land was half swamp, half scar, where the sugarcane fields swallowed men, and the wind carried whispers no one dared to repeat. The war had ended decades before, but the South had learned to reinvent its chains. The ink of the Emancipation Proclamation had long dried, yet men in striped uniforms worked the same rows their grandfathers once bled upon. The only difference now was the name on the paper. Convict leasing, they called it. Freedom with a contract. Slavery with a pen. The cane fields stretched for miles. Green knives under the sun, and from far away, you could see them lines of men moving slow, silent. Their shovels glinting like dull silver. In the distance, the warden's whistle cut through the heat like a curse. Beyond those fields stood the wooden structure locals called St. Landry House of Reform. But the men who lived there had another name for it, the Hollow. Because nothing ever left it whole. Inside walls warped by humidity and years of sweat leaned toward each other as if tired of standing. Rats scurried under bunks. A single oil lamp swung from the ceiling painting shadows that seemed to breathe. The air tasted of iron and pine sap, and somewhere beneath it all, of something older. Something that smelled like ritual smoke. That's where she was kept, the woman they called Sister Marguerite. Some said she wasn't born here. That she came from New Orleans, from the old French Quarter, where the dead were buried above the ground, and secrets were sold in whispers. Others said she'd been a midwife on the plantations near Opelousas, a healer who could stop a fever with a song or turn away a curse with the ash from her own hand. But by 1903, her healing was no longer welcome. Too many men had sworn her prayers made the guards sick. Too many had seen her light a candle and watch the wind die. The South was full of faith and fear. Every Sunday, the white churches rang with hymns about deliverance. Every night down in the quarters, black hands beat the drums of the ancestors, and the songs of Africa tangled with the psalms of the Bible. That was Louisiana, two worlds sharing one prayer and one wound. The Freedmen's Bureau had left years before. The papers called it progress. But in towns like St. Landry, progress meant new roads for wagons carrying prisoners and new walls for holding them. Angola prison was the largest a plantation reborn as a cage. But scattered across the parishes were smaller jails, wooden ones where the heat did the punishing. The Hollow was one of them. And when Sister Marguerite arrived, the guards had already heard the rumors. They said she had once walked with Marie Laveau's daughter in New Orleans, that she had learned how to speak the names that command wind and bone. They said she carried a rosary made of river stones, each bead carved with a mark the church didn't teach. And when she sang, the birds fell silent. But in 1903, Louisiana didn't care for stories of power. Not when it came from the wrong hands. The state called it superstition. The wardens called it witchcraft. And so the record was written in that same narrow, tight script that had buried thousands of others before her Laveau Marguerite. Colored. Disturbance of peace. No mention of the song. No mention of the storm that followed. Just to name one more ghost on paper. Outside the jail, the bayou hummed. Cypress knees rose from the water like reaching fingers. The night insects stitched the darkness together. And from the nearby chapel, the preacher's voice echoed, "The Lord will set you free." But the men in the fields had stopped believing in freedom. They believed in the river instead. It always carried something away, chained secrets' names. Sometimes even the bodies the guards didn't want found. Folklore says the river remembers, that every drop of it carries the breath of those who died trying to cross, or those buried in unmarked graves near its edge. And that night, when the sisters sang, the river swelled quietly, like it was listening. Somewhere between the pines and the prison walls, her voice carried low, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat. The guards called it madness. The others called it prayer. But to those who still believed in the old ways, it was something else, a summoning. The folk around St. Landry Parish still talk about her, though not often, and never after dark. They say her words were not curses, but confessions. That she sang to remind the world what it had done and what it had tried to forget. They say she asked the earth to open its mouth. And it did. That summer, the rain never stopped. Floodwaters swallowed the lower cane fields. A warden was struck blind. 3 guards disappeared on their way back from the levee. And one night, the jailhouse dogs refused to move their eyes fixed on the cell where Marguerite had been. No one remembers what happened to her after that. The record ends the same way many records do in the South, with silence. But the story didn't die. It moved quietly through the generations, passed in whispers, retold in the rhythm of the drums. A century later, an old woman in Opelousas told a WPA interviewer, "She ain't gone no, sir. You can hear her in the wind if you stand still by the river. She hums when the water rises." And so the legend lived, half in faith, half in fear. A woman condemned for knowing what the earth already knew. A song too heavy to be buried. A voice still echoing through the moss, through the years, through the iron that once held her. Because Louisiana never forgot. It just learned how to keep its secrets quiet. The first trace of her appears not in a story, but in a document. A folded sheet of yellowed paper sealed with wax, filed under Louisiana State Penitentiary, 1903. Miscellaneous offenses. The handwriting is small, careful, as if the clerk knew he was writing something no one was meant to read again. It says, Laveau Marguerite. Colored female, 33 years. Convict work release, refused to labor, sang hymns of heathen nature, disrupted peace. No mention of voodoo. No mention of a curse. Just the same bureaucratic stillness that history uses to silence the living. The file ends with one more line, ink faded to brown. Transferred to isolation, July 17th. And then nothing. No release date, no death record, no burial notice. The rest is silence and the stories that grew inside it. Locals said she had come from the bayou carrying a rosary made not of pearls, but of bones. They said when she prayed, the air changed. The moths beat their wings slower. The cicadas stopped. Even the guardsmen, hardened by work and cruelty, walked lighter past her cell. One of them, a man named Halpern, would later tell a preacher that her eyes looked like they'd seen the first river. He said that when she spoke, he felt a chill crawl down his neck. Not because she was evil, but because she believed in something he couldn't name. The preacher wrote it down in his notebook, a thin ledger found years later in a church attic in Opelousas. A woman accused of black sorcery. The guards say she prays backwards. Yet I saw her lips move in rhythm with the psalm, though in another tongue. She said the words had been given to her by the mothers of the water. I did not answer her. That line, the mothers of the water, appeared again decades later in the oral histories collected by the WPA in the 1930s. In those interviews, old freedwomen spoke of a figure called La Sœur du Fer, the Sister of Iron. They said she was a nun of no church who had been buried alive by the white men for singing too loud in the night. They said when the rain came, her song came with it. But before the story became myth, it was first a record cold clinical and incomplete. The prison at St. Landry was small, barely a dozen cells. It was built from pine boards and corrugated tin, meant to hold debtors and drifters, not the living shadows of a system that refused to die. Yet the state used it as overflow for Angola, sending prisoners who were too sick or too strange for the fields. That year, 1903, had been brutal. Yellow fever still haunted the parishes. Sugar prices had fallen. Men died by the dozens under the summer sun. The death ledgers from Angola list 34 unexplained passings between June and September. 4 of those men were recorded as having respiratory collapse during night prayers. That phrase, night prayers, puzzled later historians. Angola had no evening mass. The only prayers came from the prisoners themselves, songs that mixed the psalms of the Bible with the rhythms of Africa. They called them spirituals. The wardens called them noise. But for the men in stripes, those songs were maps. Each verse carried a code, a name, a direction, a warning. Go down. Moses meant the overseer was near. Steal away meant the river was low enough to cross. Music was the only language left unchained. And in July of that year, those songs changed. A different melody crept through the night, low, mournful, threaded with something older. Guards said it came from the cell near the chapel, the one with the woman inside. They called it the Sister's Tune. Folklore says she sang in 3 tongues, Creole French, and something that no one recognized. Some said it was African. Some said it was the language of the river itself. The prisoners claimed that when she sang, they dreamed of home, but not the homes they remembered. Homes of dust and green water. Homes with drums under the floorboards. One man, his name lost to time, carved into his tin cup. The words, "She opened the gate in song." That cup was found decades later in the mud behind what used to be the prison wall. The etching, still visible letters, crooked as if written in a hurry. The record never mentions her again, but her presence lingers between the lines, like a fingerprint smudged across the page. In 1912, a visitor from New Orleans, a professor of folklore named Charles H. Dorsey, traveled through St. Landry, collecting local ghost stories. His notes survive in the Louisiana State Archives. One entry reads, "Visited the site of the old Reform House. Locals say a woman named Marguerite once sang here, and that the rust upon the iron is her handwriting. The people bring flowers every spring. I am told the warden's grandson swears the iron bars hum when it rains." He wrote no conclusion, only a dash as if he meant to return. He never did. The church records show another detail, small but heavy. In August 1903, 1 month after Marguerite's isolation, the prison chapel recorded an unusual baptism. One unnamed child born of inmate, mother deceased, no father listed, no further mention. Some believe that child was hers, born within the walls, taken by the matrons, given to a nearby orphanage, or buried without a name. Others said the child was never real, that the baptism was a ritual, an attempt by the chaplain to cleanse the cell where she had been kept. Either way, the story grew like moss, wrapping itself around what little truth remained. And then there were the letters, a set of 3 written by a man named Benjamin Crow, a field foreman at Angola, later a deputy at St. Landry. He wrote to his wife in Baton Rouge, "There's something here I can't explain. The woman they brought from New Orleans hums in her sleep. The iron near her cell is turning. The men won't go near her door. They say they see faces in the rust." The second letter is shorter. "The priest won't come back. Says her eyes follow him when she ain't awake." The last letter is undated, its ink blotted by rain. "Last night I dreamed she walked out the door. In the morning the bars were wet like sweat. The dogs wouldn't bark. Crow was found dead a week later, bitten by a snake while clearing brush near the levee." The letters were never sent. They were found years later in a box labeled Misk, Corrisp, abandoned. Fact, folklore, and fear woven so tightly you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Some say the rusted bars from that cell were melted down and used to make a church bell in Opelousas. Others claim they were thrown into the river where they sank and grew again, sprouting vines of red iron that stain the water to this day. Whatever the truth, the records never closed. Each archive, each diary, each scrap of paper pulls closer to her name and then stops as if the ink itself refused to go further. And in that gap, that silence between sentences, her voice lingers, low, defiant, endless. "If the Lord won't open the door, the river will." The record ends, but the memory breathes. It doesn't live in the files or the ledgers. It lives in the tremor of old voices that never quite forgot. And if you listen to them, really listen, they'll take you back to one night, one final night in the hollow. It was August 1903, a few hours before dawn. The air was thick enough to drink heavy with the smell of wet earth and sugarcane. The cicadas had stopped their song, as if the night had swallowed all sound but one, the low hum coming from the women's wing. A guard named Eli Turner was on duty, 21, barely a man sent here from Baton Rouge, because his uncle had pull with the warden. He wrote about that night years later in a confession never meant for print found among the possessions of his daughter when she died in 1951. His words shake on the page, but they hold the truth tighter than any archive. "The jail was breathing, sir. That's the only way I can tell it." The boards moved like a chest rising and falling. The air pressed down. I heard her singing that one they called the Nun. I'd heard her before, always after lights out. But that night, it was different. The words didn't sound like words no more. They were like a river moving. I could feel it under my feet. Eli said he went to the door not to stop her, but to listen. He wasn't afraid then. Not yet. Through the slit in the wall, he saw her sitting on the floor, back straight, eyes open. Her hands were on her knees, palms up, as if she was holding something invisible. The lamp beside her barely glowed. The flame bent toward her like it wanted to hear. She was whispering in rhythm. The sound wasn't loud, but it was deep. He said it felt like the room itself had joined her. The wooden planks creaked on the same beat the nails sang in their sockets. And then she turned. Not fast, not startled, just slowly, until her face met his through the sliver of the door. Her eyes caught the light, and for a moment he swore they weren't brown, but gray, like the color of rain about to break. "You still think them bars are iron?" she asked. He said he didn't answer. He couldn't. She smiled, or maybe it was a wound trying to smile. "They made these bars from our blood, boy. Don't you see how they sweat?" Eli said he stepped back. He looked down, and the metal in his hand, the keyring he'd been turning nervously, was wet. But not from sweat. It smelled like the river after a storm. That's when the first noise came, a long groan from the roof. The rain hadn't started yet, but something heavy had shifted above them. He said the light flickered and the walls seemed to bow. The men in the other cells began to murmur, praying under their breath. Someone started a hymn, but it broke apart halfway through. Marguerite didn't stop singing. She didn't even look up. She began tapping her fingers against the floor, slow, deliberate. The rhythm spread like a fever through the hall. Metal against wood, bone against iron, breath against air. I knew then, Eli wrote, it wasn't her we was hearing, it was everything she'd ever been made of. The sweat, the pain, the prayers that never reached heaven. She was giving them a door. The door rattled once. Then again. He thought it was the storm coming. But when he looked out the window, the sky was still. Not a drop fell. He turned back and saw the rust crawling. Across the iron bars, thin lines of dark red spreading, pulsing. The smell of salt and rain filled the room. He ran. He didn't know why. Maybe because something in him knew this wasn't meant for him. He shouted for the warden, for the preacher, for anyone. But when they came, 2 men with lanterns and a Bible, the cell was empty. The door still locked. The lamp still burning. But the floor where she had sat was wet dark like river water. And on the wall, carved shallow into the wood, were 5 words, "The Lord won't open it." By sunrise they were searching the levee. The rain came then sudden, violent. The bayou swelled over its banks, devouring the low paths. A horse was found half submerged near the fence, eyes wide, body twisted, as if something had dragged it down. They said the flood lasted 3 days. When it receded, half the cane fields were gone. So was Eli Turner. His body was found weeks later near the Atchafalaya River, face up, mouth full of mud, eyes still open. Some said he drowned. Others said he followed her, that he heard the song and couldn't turn back. The prison never filed a report. The ledger jumped from August 15th to August 30th, as though those 2 weeks had been cut clean from time. Years later, in 1934, a photographer from the Federal Writers Project visited St. Landry Parish to document Negro folklore and superstition. He found an old man working as a church janitor, one of the last who remembered the prison before it was torn down. The man refused to give his name, but he told this, "I was there, boy. I seen that woman. She didn't die in no flood. She walked out the door. The iron opened like cloth. I seen her feet bare, bleeding. She was humming low, and every board she stepped on it bent like it knew her weight. When she reached the yard, the dogs didn't bark. They just laid down. I told the warden she gone. He said, she ain't gone. She waiting. And I swear, that night I heard that same hum out by the trees. And the water was high. The interviewer wrote it all down under the title, The Nun of Iron. He never found another witness. The old man refused to say more. When he pressed him, the janitor only whispered, "Don't wake her. She still sings when the air gets heavy." Folklore filled what the files refused to say. Some claimed Marguerite had become a spirit of the river, a guardian for those who died in chains. Others said she was punished by her own gods, bound to wander until the last field hand was free. A few believed she still lived, an old woman hiding near Opelousas, hair white, voice soft, singing to no one. In 1956, a farmer found an old rosary in the soil near the site of the hollow. It wasn't metal or pearl. It was bone, small vertebrae smoothed by time, strung together with what looked like river reed. He sold it to a trader in Lafayette, who later gave it to a museum curator. The curator described a strange residue on the beads, not rust, not paint, a reddish stain that refused to wash away. What makes the moment human isn't the miracle, but the silence after it. In that silence, you can almost hear what Eli heard, that thin, trembling note between faith and fear. Imagine the scene. The cell empty, the river still swollen, the guards standing in a doorway they can't explain. One holds the key, one holds the Bible. Both are shaking. The warden mutters something about sorcery, about punishment. But the preacher only stares. He touches the wall where her words are carved. He reads them again and again. Then, as the light breaks through the clouds, he sees something else. A thin thread of red running down the wood, glinting like sunlight through blood. He steps back. The words shimmer, not carved, not written groan. He doesn't speak of it again. But years later, when his granddaughter asks why he never preached at the prison chapel again, he says only, because that was the one place the Lord was quiet. Some stories stay alive because they were never meant to be solved. This one, the night she vanished, lives somewhere between miracle and memory. It belongs to the air that still hangs thick over the cane fields and to the rust that keeps blooming on forgotten iron. And when people say they hear her, a low hum, a whisper through the rain, they don't call it haunting anymore. They call it remembrance. Because for the ones who worked those fields, who prayed to gods that history tried to bury her song, wasn't a curse. It was a door that still waits to be opened. It began as an accident. In 1938, a young researcher named Caroline Duval, 27, part of the WPA Writers Project, arrived in St. Landry Parish with a typewriter, a camera, and a list of interview names. She was meant to collect Negro spirituals of local origin. Instead, she found a story that refused to stay silent. The people she met all started the same way, polite, cautious, unwilling. But when she mentioned the old prison, the Hollow, their eyes shifted. Some looked to the ground, others crossed themselves. And then always came the same line. "You don't want to go down that road, miss." The air still hums there. She laughed at first. She'd grown up in New Orleans, daughter of a French teacher and a Baptist mother. The supernatural, she thought, was just culture, a lens through which pain survived. But that changed the night she stayed at a farmhouse near the bayou. She wrote in her field notes, "The wind came through the shutters around midnight." It wasn't loud, but it carried a sound low rhythmic, like someone humming through water. The lamp flickered. I thought I was imagining it until the old woman in the next room began to hum with it. That old woman, identified later as Aunt Jo, aged 93, was born in bondage on a sugar plantation near Opelousas. Her memory was sharp, clear, untamed. When Duval asked about the song, Aunt Jo leaned forward and whispered, "That's the sister. She don't sleep. You think them papers lost her, but the winds still keep her name." Duval pressed record on her field cylinder. The old woman began to sing slow, cracked, trembling. "If the Lord won't open the door, the river will. The river will." The phonograph needle shuddered, caught, then continued. The sound of the river filled the background, though they were miles from it. Weeks later, Duval traced Aunt Jo's words to a forgotten set of state documents, half-burned in a courthouse storage room in Baton Rouge. They were labeled Penal System. Correspondence 1899 to 1906. Inside, between letters about sugar quotas and convict expenses, she found something else, a folded memorandum addressed to the governor's office dated August 1903. "To whom it may concern, reports of unusual phenomena at St. Landry Reform Facility continue. Local clergy request relocation of female inmate for heresy and incitement. Several guards refuse duty, citing fear of unnatural events. Recommend inspection by military or ecclesiastical authority." No name, no signature, just an official seal half-melted, pressed by hand. The phrase, "unusual phenomena," caught her attention. It reappeared 3 times in the following pages, once underlined. It had been used again in the state's insurance reports that same summer, describing property damage due to unexplained moisture infiltration. The roof of the Hollow had collapsed in August 1903. The cause listed excessive rainfall and ground movement. But Duval noticed the contradiction. No rain was recorded that week in the nearest weather report 20 miles away. She traveled to the site. By then, the prison had long since been reclaimed by the swamp. Only a few stones remained half swallowed by vines and mud. But in the center of what had been the courtyard, she found something impossible. A rusted iron gate still standing upright, its frame blackened by age, its bars fused together like melted wax. When she touched it, the metal was cold, not the soft cool of iron, but a deep chill, as if the metal remembered the river. She took a rubbing of its surface, expecting the faint pattern of corrosion. What she found instead were lines, curving, looping, deliberate. Symbols, etched not by tools but by time itself. They matched carvings Duval had seen once before, in the old cemeteries of New Orleans, on the graves marked with crosses and Vives signs of the Voodoo Loa. One in particular stood out, a double cross with circles at its ends. It was the mark of Papa Legba, the gatekeeper, the one who opens all doors. In her report to the WPA, Duval wrote cautiously, "While it is impossible to confirm the presence of ritual markings, the shapes correspond closely with those found in Afro-Creole religious practice. Given the oral tradition surrounding the so-called Nun of Iron, it is plausible that a syncretic form of spiritual resistance occurred within the prison context." Her superiors cut the paragraph from the final draft. The Federal Archive lists her project as incomplete, unpublished. But her field journals survived, discovered decades later in a trunk donated to Tulane University. The last entry reads, "I dream of the river often now. It hums when I write. When I close my eyes, I see her face not as a ghost, but as a woman watching, waiting for someone to finish her sentence." Caroline Duval vanished in 1939. Her car was found abandoned near the levee. The keys still in the ignition. The passenger seat wet. Years passed. The world changed. The fields turned to roads. The prisons grew taller. But the story stayed. It traveled quiet through hands and mouths, down generations of the same families who had once been forced to labor in that soil. In 1962, a journalist for the New Orleans Tribune revisited St. Landry after hearing rumors of singing iron unearthed during a highway construction project. The workers had struck a buried metal frame, the remnants of an old cell door. When they tried to cut through it, the saws jammed. The surface was too brittle to break. The journalist described the object as bleeding orange dust. He took a photograph, black and white grainy, showing a faint outline of what looked like fingerprints in rust. He sent the photo to the State Historical Society. They returned it with a single sentence: "This item does not correspond to any known structure." 2 weeks later, his house in Baton Rouge burned down. The negatives were never found. Folklore says that whenever the soil of Louisiana is disturbed, when the earth is cut open, when the levee gives way, when the fields are turned over for new foundations, the river demands remembrance. And each time someone hears the song. In 1971, during the construction of a bridge near Bayou Teche, workers reported a vibration under the water. One described it as a hum, like an organ under the ground. Another refused to continue, claiming he saw a woman kneeling in the current, her head bowed, her mouth moving. A local pastor blessed the sight. He said the hum stopped, but only for a while. The Times-Picayune ran a short article on it, buried under local newsbridge work, delayed by superstition. No one mentioned the name. But in the margin of the reporter's notebook, a small note survives, written in pencil. Same melody Aunt Jo sang. In 1999, an anthropology graduate named Daniel Rousseau reopened the case. His thesis, Spiritual Resistance in the Post-Emancipation South, examined how voodoo rituals functioned as coded rebellion. He traced dozens of oral histories across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia, comparing them to state prison records. One stood out. In a transcript from 1936, filed under Federal Writers Project, Negro Narratives, Louisiana, an anonymous interviewee said, "They used to say a woman sang her way out of Angola. But she didn't go far. She turned into the river. That's why the water run red sometimes. It ain't rust, it's memory." Rousseau followed the thread, visiting archives, listening to field recordings. On cylinder number 2127, dated August 1938, he found it the voice of Aunt Jo. The static was thick, the hiss almost unbearable. But behind it, faint trembling, unmistakable, the same line repeated 3 times. "If the Lord won't open the door, the river will." He slowed the recording, adjusted the pitch. Under the main voice, another sound appeared, not a second singer, not feedback, but resonance, as if the iron itself was singing back. He played it for experts. Some called it artifact distortion. Others said it was impossible. But Rousseau never doubted what he'd heard. He wrote in his thesis, "Her story exists between history and haunting." The iron remembers her because it was made from the same earth that buried her people. When she sang, she wasn't asking for escape. She was reminding the world that no cage can hold what was forged in blood. He submitted his work. It was never published. He died in a car crash outside Lafayette that same year. The recording disappeared from the Tulane archive soon after. Today, the site of the hollow is nothing but marshland and silence. The water runs shallow. The sugarcane has long since retreated. But sometimes after the storms, the ground gives up its secrets, fragments of chain pieces of iron bones, too small to name. And every now and then, a traveler walking that lonely parish road swears they hear something rise from the wind. A woman's voice. A hymn not from church but from somewhere older. They say she never left. That her song became the hum of the land. That Louisiana itself learned her rhythm. And when you stand there between the ruins and the river, you can feel it, the faint tremor of iron, remembering what freedom costs. The record never closed. It only changed its form paper to song, to river, to silence. And somewhere in that silence, Marguerite Laveau still waits not to be freed, but to be heard. It began quietly, as things buried by history often do. In 2019, a film crew from Baton Rouge set out to document forgotten prisons of the Deep South. They weren't ghost hunters, not by name, just historians with cameras and microphones drawn to the stories the state had left behind. Their lead researcher, a black historian named Dr. Naomi Baptiste, had grown up hearing whispers about the hollow. Her grandmother used to tell her never to walk near the bayou after rain, because the ground still remembers. Naomi thought it was folklore. Until the sound engineer's tape began to hum. The crew arrived in late October, the season when the water stands still, when even the wind feels hesitant. The sun was pale, the air damp. No building remained, only the faint stone outlines of the old foundation, tangled with reeds and cypress roots. They set up camp along what used to be the western wall, the same place where Caroline Duval had found the rusted gate nearly a century earlier. At dusk, they began recording ambient sound frogs wind river. The microphone hissed softly, catching the slow breathing of the swamp. Then, without warning, the static folded into a note, low, resonant, too steady to be natural. The audio log from that night still exists. You can hear Dr. Baptiste's voice, calm, professional at first. "We're getting interference, maybe radio frequency from a boat." Then the others respond. "No, it's not radio, it's tonal. It's inside the mic." The pitch deepens, rippling like air beneath metal. Someone swears. Then silence. And then faintly beneath the hum, a woman's voice. "If the Lord won't open the door." They stopped the recording, packed up, drove to the nearest town. But that night in the motel, the sound came back not from the equipment, but from the walls. The next morning, Naomi drove back alone. She wanted to prove it was nothing wind resonance, maybe the echo of trucks on the highway. She walked to the center of the site where the earth was darker, still wet from the storm. She placed her hand on the ground. It was cold, not the chill of soil, but something deeper, denser. Like the echo of water moving underfoot. She pressed her recorder to the dirt and hit play. The device flickered, then went still. Later in her journal, she wrote, "I felt it breathing, like the land was listening. The hum wasn't outside anymore. It was in my chest." At 5:37 p.m., the camera footage caught a movement, faint ripples across the surface of a puddle. No rain, no wind. Just circles spreading outward, and over it a shadow long upright, as if someone were standing just beyond the lens. The footage ends there. The screen goes black, but the audio continues, a hiss, then a soft exhale, and then almost too quiet to hear. "You came back." 3 days later, Naomi called her colleague at Tulane University, an archivist named Marcus Avery, to tell him what she'd found. He described her voice as shaking, but calm. She said she'd found a structure under the soil metal fragments, forming a square like a frame. She believed it was part of the original cell. She wanted to excavate it properly. The next week, she filed a request with the State Preservation Office. It was denied. Reason: ground instability potential, water contamination. But Naomi didn't stop. She funded the dig herself. They began in December, the cold season when the cane fields stand dry and brittle. The excavation was small, just her and 2 assistants. But what they uncovered was not a foundation, it was a door. A door made of iron. It was buried flat facing upward, like something the earth had swallowed whole. The hinges were fused, the edges rimmed with river silt, and across its surface, faint but visible, a series of markings, curved lines, interlocking crosses, the same sigils Caroline Duval had described in her notes from 1938. Naomi brushed the dirt away carefully. She whispered not a prayer, not a spell, just a line from the spirituals her grandmother used to sing. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Then why not every man? The air shifted. Her assistant swore, the temperature dropped. The camera caught condensation forming in mid-air breath where no one was breathing. And then the hum returned, this time louder, rhythmic, like something alive pressing against the ground beneath them. The sound came through the iron, a vibration too slow for machines, too deep for instruments. Naomi reached out and touched it. For 2 seconds, everything stopped. The camera froze, the microphone died, the light dimmed. And then came the voice. Not from the recorder, from the air. If the Lord won't open the door. Naomi's assistant screamed. The sound fractured. Static filled the audio. But her voice cut through, calm, steady, almost reverent. The river will. Then silence. When they played the footage later, the last frame showed her face, eyes open, fixed on the door. And beneath her, a thin stream of water seeping from the soil, curling around her boots like smoke. The site was sealed the next day. State authorities called it a safety closure. The dig was listed as incomplete. But a week later, Marcus received a package at Tulane, unmarked, no return address. Inside was Naomi's notebook, wrapped in a piece of damp cloth. The pages were warped but legible. In the final entry dated December 17, 2019, she wrote, "It's not a haunting. It's a remembrance. The iron remembers her, and the river answers. I think the song was never meant for escape. It was meant for return. The same door that took her waits to open again." And then a line written in darker ink, hurried, slanted. The sound is under me now. The ground is breathing. She was never seen again. In February 2020, the local sheriff's department issued a brief statement. Investigation ongoing. Possible flood incident. But there was no flood that month. No storm, no rainfall recorded. Just a low mist over the bayou that lasted 3 days, refusing to lift. During that time, fishermen reported hearing music under the water. One described it as a woman humming slow, like she waiting for someone. Another swore he saw light beneath the surface, a pale glow moving with the current, tracing the shape of a cross. When the mist finally cleared, the excavation pit had filled completely. The soil was smooth again, as if nothing had been disturbed. Marcus visited the site himself a month later. He found no sign of the dig, no tools, no markers, only the faint smell of metal in the air. But when he stood there recording notes, his microphone began to vibrate. The playback revealed something, a low hum, then a voice. Faint, female, whispering through static. "The Lord won't open it." And then, as if from a distance, "But you did." The footage, Naomi's notes, and the recovered audio are now part of a locked collection in the state archives. The file is marked Restricted Access Cultural Sensitivity. Only the first 30 seconds are public ambient wind river and that faint vibration that sounds almost like a breath. To this day, no one can explain it. Audio engineers call it resonance from underground pipes. Geologists say it's seismic movement. But neither theory accounts for the rhythm perfectly, even like a heartbeat. And every time someone tries to amplify it, the waveform forms the same pattern, 5 curved lines crossing in the center. The same mark found on the rusted gate. The same symbol Duval described. The same shape carved into the wood of her cell, over 100 years ago. So what does that leave us with a vanished prisoner? A century of echoes. A song that refuses to die. Maybe she was a priestess, maybe a prophet, or maybe just a woman who had seen too much and learned to turn suffering into sound. What matters is that it still moves. Through the soil, through the metal, through the voices that keep telling her name. And perhaps that's what she meant by her last line. Not a curse, not a plea, but a truth. If the Lord won't open the door, the river will. The river always flowing, always returning, the only thing that cannot be locked. Imagine it now as the camera drifts over the Louisiana wetlands. The cypress knees rising like old bones, the wind carrying the smell of iron and rain. The hum grows louder. Not menacing, just steady, ancient. Then faintly beneath it, another sound chains loosening one link at a time. The screen darkens. A voice distant, half singing, half breathing. The river remembers. The river remembers. And somewhere just before the frame fades to black, a flicker of movement beneath the water. A hand. A rosary of bone. A voice humming through the current. History calls it legend, but the land calls it something else. It calls it return. The file should have ended there. The film reels packed the sound logs, sealed the archives, closed. But history doesn't end. It lingers soft as a breath behind glass, waiting for someone to press play again. The story of Marguerite Laveau. The voodoo nun of iron became one of those quiet inheritances of Louisiana. Never printed in textbooks, never taught in schools. It lived in kitchens, in church basements, in the verses of songs sung low enough to pass as prayers. In 2022, a historian named Celeste Dubois, great-granddaughter of a freedman from St. Landry Parish, began digitizing forgotten WPA recordings. Her project was simple: to restore the voices of the old singers, the field preachers, the women who spoke of healing and haunting. But one night, late almost dawn, she came across cylinder number 2127. It was unlabeled, scratched, half decayed. She cleaned it gently, pressed record on her software, and let it play. The static came first, thick and heavy like rain on tin. Then the voice, fragile, quivering, wrapped in the hum of time. If the Lord won't open the door, the river will. Celeste froze. She'd heard that phrase before in her grandmother's lullabies, whispered just before sleep. But hearing it now from a voice that had been gone for almost a century felt like standing in a doorway between two worlds. The waveform on her screen trembled, then steadied. Behind the voice, she caught it a vibration, deep and low. The same hum Naomi had recorded in 2019. It was still there, still alive. She sat back, closed her eyes, and listened, not as a scholar, but as someone being called. That week she drove south following the old parish roads until the map gave up. The land grew wetter, quieter. The sugarcane gave way to cypress and moss. The road ended at a low levee, and beyond it, the water, still gray, endless. She stepped out, recorder in hand. The wind was barely moving. The air smelled of iron and rain. Somewhere a bird called long and mournful, and then silence again. She stood there for nearly an hour. Nothing. No hum, no voice. Just the steady drip of water against her boots. But as she turned to leave, the soil shifted under her feet, a slow exhale from the ground itself. The recorder flickered. A frequency appeared, faint, erratic. And then the song, not loud, not clear, just the echo of a woman's breath crossing 100 years. The same line, the same rhythm. Celeste didn't move. She let it play through her bones, that sound that was never meant to be heard again. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking. "I hear you." She returned to Baton Rouge with the recording, labeled it, "Field Note, the River Will." The file sits today in a digital archive open to the public, though few ever find it. It lasts only 48 seconds. The last 6 seconds are silence. But when played on high volume, the spectrogram reveals something that's not sound at all, but shape: a curve, a cross, and 5 small circles, the same V that marked the gate. the same one drawn by Marguerite's hand in 1903. No one can explain it. Maybe coincidence, maybe artifact. But the archivists who handle the file say the temperature drops every time they press play. In St. Landry Parish, the locals still keep the old belief. When the air grows heavy, when the mist rolls over the bayou and the frogs fall silent, they leave small candles by the water. Some call it ritual, some call it respect. But to the elders, it's remembrance and offering to the woman who sang for the dead and made the river remember. The younger ones tell it as a ghost story. They whisper about a nun in white who walks the edge of the swamp, rosary in hand, eyes full of stormlight. They say she appears before floods, warning those who listen. They say her song still moves under the bridges, a warning hum, a promise. The state doesn't recognize her. No marker bears her name. But every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, someone leaves a bouquet of white lilies and a strand of bone beads at the levee road. The sheriff says he's never seen who does it. The flowers just appear. From the archives to the field, from the mouths of the old to the hum of the iron, the story refuses to die. Because it isn't just about her. It's about every name written once and lost. Every record cut short. Every voice that sang to the dark, hoping someone someday would answer. The river carries them all, the enslaved, the forgotten, the vanished. Its current is history's bloodstream. And if you listen close enough, it still speaks. A sound beneath sound, a heartbeat underwater. The kind of song that doesn't end, it changes shape. It becomes the hum of the land, the whisper in the wind, the low vibration in the bones of those who still remember what was taken. And perhaps that's what Marguerite meant, not that the river would open the door, but that it was the door, the passage between the world that punished her and the one that finally listened. Fade in. A present-day drone shot sweeps over the Louisiana bayou, mist rising from the cypress trees, the sun just breaking over the horizon. The hum returns distant, layered with the rhythm of paddles breaking water. The voiceover comes quiet. The tone steady, reverent, like the closing of a prayer. History tells us she vanished. The records say nothing more. But if you stand here on this ground, where the river bends and the air hangs thick, you'll understand why her story never left. Because this place, this silence, is her voice. Cut to black. The hum fades. Then one last whisper, the river will, and then the credits roll, white letters over black water. Narrated by the land itself. Written by those who were never allowed to. You've just heard a file from a history that never closed. Subscribe and keep their voices alive.